Hello, hello. It's Jacob Hill with GRC Academy. Today I'm here with Miss Stacy Bostjanick. Stacy, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Doing very well. Thank you so much for coming on. And folks, if you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to like, comment, share, subscribe, review, all the things. Helps me out. Thanks so much in advance. Well, Stacy, tell us about yourself. How did you get to where you are today?
I've had a long government career. I actually started at NSWC White Oak back in the day as a secretary with the applied math branch. They used to tease me and tell me I was working with the eggheads. So I worked there, and then I got into contracting at NSWC. And then when they blew up, I don't know, do you remember that?
I don't.
So they had a bunker full of explosive. Its relevant temperature, when it was spread out, they had like a powder. When it was spread out on the table, it didn't get hot. But when they combined it and put it in the bunker, the temperature of that, it was a test powder, right? It was a new kind of powder. The temperature went up. And so it exploded, and they said it was wild. There was a guy's office. His office was fine. You walked out the door, and there was this huge crater.
Oh, wow.
So as a result, they closed that base. It was BRAC. And so I went to the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Then I worked for 13 years as a contracting officer, contract specialist at the Naval Air Systems Command. From there, I went to the ODNI, and then I did a joint duty assignment down at the FBI on Quantico. I was at the lab. Then I worked for the Missile Defense Agency. Then I was the head of contracting at DIA. And when I was at DIA, they make all of their senior executives rotate after so many years. And so I was up on my rotation, and I actually called the Pentagon talking to Shea Assad and said, hey, do you guys need any help over there? And he's like, yeah. So while I was there, I got pulled into the Protecting Critical Technologies Task Force. We called it the PICTIF. While I was on the PICTIF, I met Katie Arrington. She was working the CMMC perspective at that point in time, trying to get her hands around how can we in acquisition ensure that our information is being protected. I'm going to start geeking out with contract numbers, right? So the 252-204-7012 clause was begun in like 2013, right? And they tried to get it through rulemaking, and they had a lot of comments. It took a long time to get consensus and everybody to rally around in industry what we could do. So the 7012 clause was published in 2016 with an effective date that you must comply if you handle CUI with the NIST SP 800-171 by 31 December 2017. So in 2018, the DoD IG and the Navy Cyber Readiness Review went out and did an assessment of companies. Like, are they really compliant? Are they doing what they're supposed to? And we basically found out they weren't. So At one point, I left the PICTIF and I began working directly with Katie to get on top of this issue. And so what happened was when we found out that companies really weren't complying, they really weren't doing what they were supposed to, Secretary Shanahan at the time said, hey, we got to validate that the people we're giving our critical and important information to are doing what we're asking them to do, right? That they are actually protecting this critical data. So that we stood up, we tried to figure out what, how could we get at this? So we stood up the DCMA, DIBCAC, right? The Defense Contract Management Agency, Defense Industrial Base Cyber Assessment Center. That's a bunch of letters and a big mouthful of stuff. But we had assessment teams that could go out and start looking at different companies, right? We had a purchasing requirement that every 3 years, the companies who had cross-type contracts had to have a purchasing system review. So we leveraged that to be able to start working with companies to figure out whether or not they were meeting the requirements for the NIST 800-171. But it became evident rapidly that they wouldn't be resourced. They wouldn't be able to handle the whole magnitude of companies that would be handling CUI to make sure that they were assessed. So that's how we ended up coming up with the paradigm of CMMC, right? So we began working with Carnegie Mellon SEI and Johns Hopkins APL to try to put the construct of the program together. We looked at FedRAMP and we decided we wanted to model our program after the way the FedRAMP was. We also looked at CMMI and how well that had worked and what have you. And we gathered a lot of information. We put an RFI out looking for different companies that could manage this for us. Mm-hmm. And, FedRAMP has a no-cost contract with A2LA, and so we wanted to go down that path as well because we recognized that resourcing was short. We didn't want to have to impose on the taxpayer a huge bill to pay somebody to do this. So that's how we handled it. So we put the RFI out, and nobody came back and said they could do everything, right? And so we said, okay, we will go out to industry. So I think it was like November 19th of 2019, I think, we had an industry day, and it was at PSC in Arlington. And it was live streamed. We had about 400 or 500 people live stream. We had about 400 or 500 people in the audience, and we went in, we pitched like, this is what we're looking for. We're looking for industry to come together and form this and put this together. And then we said, and now we're going to leave. We're going to let you guys talk about it. And out of it came the first CMMC board that had all volunteers. And those guys worked with us for about a year, all on a voluntary basis. They all had day jobs and they were doing this at night. But they were equally as passionate about getting the job done as we were because they recognized the national threat. So out of that, CMMC was born.
How far would you say this goes back, this need for CMMC?
I'd say it goes back to the very beginning in 2012, 2013, when we started using CUI, right? When that program came out. But we didn't know that at the time, right? So, you put a clause out like that. We say, okay, we're going to depend on you to tell us the truth, and, we're going to trust you. And so, that this is an initiative we really got to get ahead of, for better, for worse, right? I mean, it's human nature. If you can do it without having to spend a ton of money, you're going to do it without having to spend a ton of money. And so I think what happened with industry is they decided, hey, the letter of the law says I have to have a system security plan and I have to have a POA&M, and that's it, right? Now, our assumption or interpretation was that, yeah, okay, you have a POA&M, but you're actively working to burn those down and become compliant because you understand that you have my special information. And the DIBCAC's gone out and done several assessments, and one of the anecdotes was they assessed a company, their POA&Ms weren't even going to be closed till 2099.
Oh wow, yeah.
Well, I'll be dead by then, right? I mean, how many years are you going to leave my data and information exposed? So we probably needed, when we started this whole thing, to have a validation capability built in from the get-go. We just didn't realize we needed to until later. And so, had we had a crystal ball and been able to see that from the very beginning, the program probably would have gone through a lot faster. It wouldn't have been, we wouldn't have met some of the roadblocks that we've met.
From what I understand, the CMMC program was initially under OUSD ANS, and then it was migrated over to DoD CIO. Tell us a story about that. What was the reason why and what actually happened?
At the end of the Trump administration, CMMC was being run out of ANS under the CISO for ANS. And with the administration departing, they subordinated CISO ANS under industrial base policy. And so when we got moved under industrial base policy, the DASD that came in that was running it was not comfortable with cyber, right? And of course, Ms. Arrington ended up leaving the department. So we were kind of adrift. And so at one point, the Deputy Secretary of Defense said, it makes good business sense to put all things cyber in CIO and have it managed there. So we were moved out of ANS and consolidated under CIO for cybersecurity.
I'm not exactly sure the timeline of things here, but CMMC 1.0, right? And then it went under review. Tell us the backstory there.
When we initially started this, right, and of course, lessons learned, We originally started only implementation of CMMC through a 48 CFR rule, and now there are two forms of CFR. There's a 32 CFR, which establishes a program regulatorily, and then the 48, which adds a clause to the DFAR. Okay, so we thought we could do it just with a DFARS clause. We wouldn't need to memorialize everything in 32. We were lucky enough that OMB OIRA gave us an interim rule, right? Which means you can implement right after public comment. You don't have to adjudicate all the comments and finish the process of reviewing the rule before you can implement. So we were going to be able to implement November of 2020, right? The administration changed. We had received about 750 comments on our rule. And the new administration said, you know what? We think we need to take a strategic pause and make sure that we're making the rule what we want it to be, and we're not being overly burdensome to the DIB. So when we had CMMC 1.0, we had done a lot of evaluation. We looked at the NIST 800-171 standard that was out there. We felt that there were like 20 more requirements that probably would have brought more maturity into the system. And that's why we added those on. CMMC 1.0, we did put that model out about 8 times for industry to be able to comment on, but it was not a formal comment period through OMB OIRA. So as a result, we stood up a tiger team. We had 3 different people from CIO, a guy from DCMA DIBCAC, and another lady from ANS that were an independent tiger team to review the program. They came up with 8 recommendations. Those recommendations went through an executive steering group that had representatives from across the department to come up with where we thought we needed to go with the program. And so as a result, we stripped out those extra 20 requirements. We made sure we totally just aligned with the NIST 800-171. We didn't ask any more of companies than they had been asked to do since 2017. We changed it from 5 levels to 3 to shorten it, to make it easier for companies to understand, to become compliant. And then we also allowed for POA&Ms and waivers.
When CMMC 2.0 was initially announced, there was a great silence for a while. And then we finally got the proposed rule in December. What was happening in the interim?
Hours and hours of work. So, it took a long time to put together all 438 pages of that rule. So there's a very structured process or procedure when you're in rulemaking. You have to document your rule, right, down to the nth degree of what each piece part is, right? And if you read our rule, there's a lot of redundancy in the writing, right? CMMC level 1 has the 15 requirements that are in the FAR 52.204-21. Those have been established and they're very simplistic. CMMC level 2 for self-assessment is the 110 controls in the NIST 800-171 Rev 2. Level 2 certified with the C3 PAOs, exactly the same. You have to meet the NIST 800-171 110 controls, but you'll have to have a C3 PAO come in. They'll do an assessment and certify that you meet them. For CMMC level 3, you will have to have a CMMC level 2 certification from a C3 PAO. And then you will have to have the 24 requirements out of the NIST 800-172, and that will be assessed by the DCMA DIBCAC. If a solicitation comes out, it could have a requirement for the additional 11 requirements under the 172, but that will be outside the CMMC process, and that will be something that the program office will have to handle on their own. But you have to say, okay, company wants to get this, you have to do A, B, C, D, and E, right? So you have to explain it to the nth degree. And I have to admit, if you reference an instruction or what have you and don't put it directly in the rule, if there's a need for an adjustment or a change, then you can change it outside of the rulemaking process. Mm-hmm. But our OMB OIRA gurus, guides, required us to put all that in the rulemaking process, right? That's why all the assessment guides and all that kind of stuff are included, because Now, if I need to change it, I have to go through rulemaking. And, I never did finish the reason why there's such a blackout period for speaking, right? So OMB-OIRA wants to make sure that everybody gets the information at the same time, right? They view that there would be an unfairness if I talked to you about what's in my rule, but I didn't talk to somebody else, and you got to understand what was in the rule before another company. So you would have an unfair advantage because you'd have more time to prep or prepare. So that's why we have that right now. So you document your whole rule. It has to go through your agency for everybody in your agency to agree to it, right? Yeah. And DoD's a big agency, and they got a lot of people that have opinions.
Yes.
Definite opinions. And so we get through that, and then it has to go through interagency review. So all the other federal agencies get to read your rule, right? So we had a couple of gotchas because it's a significant rule, right? We were so excited. We got everything through interagency the first time. And we were like, oh, December 2nd, we can get it out. We can get it out for public comment. We're rocking it, right? And then they went, oh, sorry, but the Federal Register has to do a review of your incorporated by reference submission, and then they also have their legal staff do a full review of the rule.
Okay.
So December 2nd turned into, oh, no, there's another 30-day review process, and we were deflated. We were like, you got to be kidding me.
Yeah.
We were lucky, though, because the recognition of the threat to the United States, everybody in the process really banded together and pulled hard to make sure we got through the process as fast as we could. So we ended up releasing the proposed rule on the 26th of December. I did get a lot of guff for doing it over the Christmas holidays, but for the public comment period to begin. And then you receive the public comments. And after the public comments, you have to adjudicate all those. You have to come up with an answer for everything, right? Then after you get through all those, your OMB-OIRA desk officer reviews your comments and your adjudication of those comments, decides whether or not you've done an adequate job. Then it goes back through interagency within the department for everybody in the department to review again. What changes did you make based on the comments, all that kind of stuff. Then it goes back through interagency again. Then after it gets through interagency again, and after the public comment, before it goes into the interagency, SBA also gets a personal review. And then after all that, you can go to publication. But because we are a significant rule, it has to go through the Congressional Review Act. So once I published it on the 15th of October, there's a 60-day Congressional Review Act. And if you didn't finish your rule by April 30th, the year before a new Congress is seated, what happens is you go through, like right now we're going through the 60-day Congressional Review Act with this Congress. When the new Congress gets seated in January, I think it's January 7th, 15 days after they are seated, you get another 60-day review process that begins that they can go back. Now, with the Congressional Review Act, it's a go, no go, right? They either kill it or they leave it alone. So we don't anticipate there being any issue with the rule through the Congressional Review Act. It was started under the Trump administration. It got eased under the Biden administration. And so I think the Trump administration is eager to let it go because they recognize the threat to national security. I do know that the Trump administration is very cognizant of regulations on the DIB, and they don't want to impose anything that's not necessary. But I think they recognize the need for this because of the national security issue with our data going out the door.
I also remember the proposed rule coming out, and I was so excited because I have CMMC training for defense contractors. I was like, great, my Christmas vacation leave, I'm going to review this rule. I'm going to get it all updated. And then it was delayed. And, so I do remember that time very well. Talk to us about some of the biggest changes that you would like to highlight to the DIB.
I think from 1.0 to 2.0, you recognize all the changes that we made to make it more simplistic. We made sure we totally just aligned with the NIST 800-171. We didn't ask any more of companies than they had been asked to do since 2017. We changed it from 5 levels to 3 to shorten it, to make it easier for companies to understand, to become compliant. And then we also allowed for POA&Ms and waivers. When you look at the CMMC requirements, level 1, there are none of those requirements that can be POA&M. Those all must be met. There are 15 basic ones, so there's no reason that those aren't easy to meet. Level 2 and level 3 each have components that can be POA&M, and those are defined strictly in the rule. I would recommend everybody go look that up and make sure they understand and read our assessment guides to understand how those POA&Ms work there. CMMC has a provision for conditional award status if you have open POA&Ms. What will happen is your C3 PAO will come in, they'll do an assessment. They can issue a conditional status, which means you can get a contract award, but you must close those requirements within the 180 days. If not, the contracting officer will have to take action against that contractor, in the form of either a stop work or, a termination, show cause letter, things of that nature, to get that contractor back on status, because your ability to hold CUI at that time will be in question. That's what we've allowed for POA&Ms. Now, those POA&Ms have to be closed within 180 days, right? 6 months. I think you have to close your POA&Ms. Yeah. So you would get your C3 PAO to come in. They would give you a conditional approval, but then they would have to come back at the end and revalidate that you've closed those POA&Ms. But it will allow you to move forward and garner a contract award while you work on closing out those other ones. But this open-ended POA&Ms out to 2099 wasn't particularly helpful, so we had to bound it. CMMC can also be waived for a program, but that has to be done by the program manager and the SAE. For each service and for each agency, the agency is a component acquisition executive, and the SAE is the service acquisition executive. It's the top acquisition professional for that group. Right. Okay. So the guy that's in charge of all your contracts and acquisition stuff and decisions, you'd have to go to him or her and say, do you mind? We don't think we can do this. And he would sign the waiver. And then that would get reported to CIO so we could track and understand what has been waived and where those vulnerabilities lie. If a program is going to get waived out of CMMC, what happens is that program manager recognizes that the commercial entities or the DIM partners that would possibly bid on it could not be CMMC certified, that it's too young of a technology, and so therefore they would go to their SAE and say, hey, we don't think that these guys can be compliant. We're going to waive that requirement, but we're going to manage the risk in another way, right? Because why are we going to pay taxpayer money for a program to be developed that the technology's already been exfilled by our adversaries, right? Mm-hmm. We've just lost our competitive advantage, right? Because now they can pick it up and they, what happened with the F-35 and some of the other weapon systems that have been stolen by our adversaries, they downloaded the plans and they built it. We spent all the money to develop it, right? And they didn't spend a dime. They just stole our plans and built the same thing, right? I'm not going to make it easy for them. And I don't want my warfighter to go up against an exact replica of the same weapon system. I want him to have the advantage. I want him to have military superiority, right? Right. I mean, these are people's lives at stake. I think based on the public comments, we had the phased rollout. In the original proposed rule, the first phase was only 6 months. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the companies came in and were like, no, don't do that to us. It's too fast, give us more time. So we recognized the need for more time, and we allowed that to go 12 months. Mm-hmm. Now, I will tell you that we had some representatives from the administration at some point during the public agency review that came in and said, no, we want you to change it and have everything implemented, even the level 3, within 12 months. Wow. Now, luckily, if we had done that, we would have had to go back through public comment again. So therefore, all the time saved would have been eaten, right? Mm-hmm. So we were able to convince them to stay the course where we are. We extended that phase 1 by another 6 months, which gives companies a little, phase 1 is still doing your self-assessment, but it's your self-assessment under the CMMC rules, right? Which means you need to have your POA&Ms closed within 6 months. You need to be doing your annual affirmations that you are meeting and abiding by the requirements. So it's not exactly the same one that you had before, where it was just kind of like, yeah, just go kind of look at stuff and let us know. This is going to be the formal self-assessment. It'll be registered in the Supplier Performance Risk Systems first database, and contracting officers will be able to look at what you evaluate yourself at in SPRS. So that shortening of phase 1 was probably one of the biggest gifts that we gave the DIB.
Something we saw in the proposed and obviously the final rule is the concept of security protection data. Is that more of a scoping measure, or do you all view that as something that also should be protected?
We also got a lot of comments about the security protection data that the ESPs and CSPs would be handling. And a lot of people are like, hey, that log data is not CUI. So why do we have to become CMMC certified? So we backed off and we said, you're right. If it's not CUI, you do not have a requirement to become CMMC certified. Now, the good news is that reduces the work and the encumbrance on those providers. The bad news is the companies who are using those capabilities have really got to understand the data and where their data flows and understand how that works, because what's going to happen is when your assessor comes in, you're going to have to provide that body of evidence from that ESP, MSP, CSP that you're working with to demonstrate that you meet the requirements. And if something happens that you unknowingly are passing CUI through those guys, you're not going to get your certification. The whole reason why that got called out is because when we originally said if you use ESPs, they need to be certified, the public comment came back and said, wait a minute, security protection data is just logs, right? Well, security protection data, and remember, I'm not a super technical cyber geek, right? I'm more on the acquisition side. But the way they explained it to me is it depends. Security protection data could just be logs, right? And so depending on what you're doing with that security protection data, if it's not CUI, then we wanted to give those companies that were doing the log reviews the ability not to have to get that certification. As a company, buyer beware, you got to know what's in that security protection data, whether or not it's considered CUI or not, and make sure that you cover that and protect that. And so, but we didn't want to call it out because, it was brought to our attention that not always is that CUI. And so why are you making me do something I don't need to do? And we said, okay, we're not unreasonable. In fact, we laughed because, there were those on LinkedIn that were like, they got through public comment too fast. That means they didn't change anything. And we were all giggling, waiting for the proposed rule to come out. And one of my employees was like, I want to see their face when they see what we put out there. So, yeah, we really did. And when we went through those comments, the team was amazing, right? Because they came up with a process and procedure to maximize the efficiency of what. Please understand, right? We had an individual that would write an answer. The team would review it and work it. Then it would go up to the next level supervisor to be reviewed. Then I would review it. Then we had OGC review it. And then it was finalized. So we had quite the process for everything, because everything we did had to go through our legal counsel, had to go through multiple layers of approval and review to ensure we were doing the right thing. So that's how the protection security data ended up where it is.
Let's talk about CMMC Level 2. And there is a section that talks to an option for self-assessment. What is the criteria for determining what contracts are eligible for CMMC self-assessments opposed to certification?
So, there's a CUI registry where we list the different categories of CUI. NARA has one. I think DoD has one as well. So we have determined that there are some areas that would be CUI that not necessarily raise to the level of a major issue if our adversaries got a hold of the data. So if it's not a huge issue, and I think, historical archaeological data would be one category that we would presume if you're doing a contract with that, you would only need to do self-assessment. We're trying to make sure that we are not imposing more requirements on the DIB than absolutely necessary. We have a memo that's going through coordination that will hopefully be released soon that will describe the leveling for the program managers and the contracting officers to understand what level. Now, it's one thing I want to make clear and say publicly, especially since I came from the contracting background. I don't want any of my friends to shoot me. Mm-hmm. It is not the contracting officer's responsibility to determine the level. It is the program manager and the program management team and their information security specialists that need to evaluate that data and understand what level CMMC protection it needs. The contracting officer needs to understand it undoubtedly because they're going to be working with the contractor and the conduit to deal with that contractor. But in my mind's eye, a couple things need to happen, right? So your solicitation is going to come out and it's going to have a level as part of it. Those primes, when they look at it, they're going to have to understand what that data is when they put together their proposal teams, right? Because you're going to need, if you're going to have to pass any of that data, you got to validate that the subcontractor has the capability and the requirements to protect that, right? You can't pass level 2 data to a company that doesn't have a CMMC certification. So you got to validate that. So you got to understand the data, and you got to understand and have the conversation with the program office. Okay, this part of the data is level 2, right? So let's talk an aircraft, right? Let's say that the guidance system of that aircraft would rise to the level 2, right? Because if that got compromised, if our adversaries understood that, then we wouldn't want them to know that data because they could compromise it. But the landing gear is the same landing gear that's used on the Boeings. The designs are out there. Everybody knows it's already public information. Those contractors dealing with that would only need FCI. But don't pass them the entire tech data package where it has the guidance system information in there, right? You need to say, and if you're the small, don't pass me that. Just give me what I need for my landing gear, and then I only need to be a level 1. Hopefully, the contracting officers and the program managers will have a industry day where you can talk about that, and that companies are going to have more in-depth knowledge about the solicitations than they ever did before to understand the levels of the data and where that lies. So the level up memo's coming out. We've got training through DAU that's going to be both for contractors and contracting officers and program managers so that they all understand, because I know everybody said, you don't do a good job of marking CUI today, and I don't even know if I have it. So CMMC will also be a good thing for the government because it'll be a forcing factor. It's going to force us to learn. It's going to force us to pay attention. And I do expect that there's going to be a pendulum, right? They're going to come out and everybody's going to be like, oh, my program's important. It needs to be a level, blah, blah, blah. And then they're going to look at it and go like, okay, no, we need to be a little bit more thoughtful about how we apply this. And I think we'll end up coming back to the middle and everything will settle out once we get used to doing it, right? Everything's muscle memory.
I do think one of the biggest issues, and you highlighted it, is that DoD, as you said, is not the best at marking information and things like that. We've seen entire PWSs marked as CUI. And I'm like, where is the CUI? Because that makes it actually difficult to share with teaming partners and things like that.
Yeah.
We encountered a situation like that. And we had to come up with a way to address it, just to share it, right? Just to write a response.
That's exactly right. So that's part of the problem. We need to make sure, and we need to make sure that we only provide the bare minimum data to get you started, right? But that's hard. Because I'm sure Prime's like, well, I need everything before I can price it out, right? And I can't give you a price and win the bid unless I have all the data. So it's kind of a chicken and egg thing that we're going to have to work through, and we're going to have to figure out how to manage that as we go forward. Maybe what we do is we start looking at some of these cloud service offerings where maybe we do solicitations in an environment where everybody can see it but not download it. Right. So then they can understand what's there, prepare their proposal, and then they can disseminate the data later on.
Mhm.
And I think all these things will come. It's just, we got to get there.
What is the criteria for DoD to determine the highest priority programs and where CMMC level 3 will be used?
Well, if I tell you, I have to kill you.
Okay, understand.
So what we've done is we've looked at the different programs across the department, and each one of the services and agencies will nominate what they think needs, what technologies, what capabilities we think are going to be important and liable to advanced persistent threat, right?
Yeah.
So the 172 is where we start bringing requirements in that could possibly stop state actors. So we only want to impose those requirements because they are a lot more exquisite. They're a lot more costly on the different programs where we think our adversaries are actually targeting those, right? Today, if you're a company and you're like, well, I don't know if I'm going to be 2 or 3 or 1, think about what you work on and whether or not you think it would be something that our adversaries are interested in, right? So we know that the F-35 was part of that, right? Our adversaries were very interested in getting the design of that. So if you are doing something like that, then you may want to at least be a level 2. And if you're dealing with some of the exquisite parts of that aircraft that we really don't want our adversaries to be able to have, then you would want to go for level 3. The good thing is some of these cloud service providers are also looking at level 3 capabilities as well. So that might be a better avenue. I don't know.
Hey everyone, Jacob here. Let me tell you about today's sponsor, Vanta. As the number and severity of third-party breaches continues to rise, companies are increasingly vigilant, not just about how they handle their own data, but how their vendors do as well. For security and compliance leaders, this means more security reviews are coming across your desk every day, and valuable time is being wasted on manual security reviews. With Vanta questionnaire automation, security and compliance teams can complete security reviews up to 5 times faster, giving you time back to focus on running your security and compliance programs. Over 8,000 global companies like ZoomInfo, Smart Recruiters, and Noibu use Vanta to save time on security reviews. Visit vanta.com/GRC Academy to learn more about questionnaire automation. That's vanta.com/GRC Academy. Thanks and enjoy the rest of the episode.
Let's dive into 800-171 Revision 3. You've started the rulemaking process already. That's really great to hear. I, for one, am excited to see Revision 3 come through. 800-171 Revision 2, in my mind, is kind of antiquated at this point, which you alluded to, the bigger problem that rulemaking will create just based on the time it takes to get something through. I think I saw in another interview with you, you mentioned there's an ODP working group. Can you talk to us about that? Would those ODP values that are recommended, would those be part of the rulemaking process in the comment period as well?
In the rule today, we had to settle on Rev 2 because Rev 3 wasn't finished before we started going through the interagency and that kind of stuff, right? And you can't change horses midstream. So we had to stick with Rev 2. We have already started the rulemaking process to bring in Rev 3 of the 171. Meanwhile, NIST is updating the 172 to publish a Rev 3. They've just gone out with public comment. Now, my Rev 171 Rev 3 work will be done before they finish the Rev 3 work for the 172. So as soon as I finish the rulemaking for the 171 Rev 3, I'm going to start the rulemaking for the 172 Rev 3. We're not keeping with the pace of the threat. Right? Rulemaking is a 1.5 to 2 year process. And where we're going to find ourselves is we're going to be playing catch up. My dream is that we as a nation recognize the threat and we get ahead of it. Right? And that companies recognize that they've got to do this almost like back when we did OSHA. Back when we do the UL stuff for our electrical, right? I mean, I'm sure everybody was not happy with the extra money they had to spend to do that back then, but we recognized the need and everybody came along eventually, right? Cyber is going to be that thing. Now, what we've done is we got together with the DIB SCC working group, right? So we engage with industry to hear, right? Because, I mean, like one of the ODPs is how many characters your password has to be and how long the laptop can stay active after you walk away before you have to re-enter your password, right? And so, for us in the department, they set a more stringent requirement. So we are encumbered by having to put in our password more often. But, our industry partners are like, do you understand that drives cost for us as well? I mean, and so, there is a sweet spot that we need to hit. Yeah. So we've gotten together with the DIB SCC. I think there were like 80 ODPs. At one point, we were begging Vicki Piliteri at NIST to define them, right? And she's like, nope, we're not doing it. And originally, it was only going to be 40. And then when it came out, it was 80. So we're like, well, So we got together, we put it into a directive that will go through DoD Department CIO for coordination. So if R&E is like, oh no, you can't have it be that short, you've got to make it longer, we'll have to adjudicate, just kind of like the rulemaking, we'll have to adjudicate the comments, we'll have to negotiate with them to make sure that we have everybody in agreement. And then I've been chairing a federal CISO council. Once we get that through DoD, then I'll take those ODPs to the Federal CISO Council and try to make sure that we get agreement across all federal agencies right now. Because it doesn't make sense. If NASA's going to say you can have it open for 15 minutes, DoD says you can only have it open for 5 minutes, and then you've got companies going, well, if I service both, you're killing me, right? Sure. So pick one and stick to it. We're trying to, ease the burden for industry. So once that gets through all that process, I think they will be part of the rule and would have to go through the public comment, but I'm not positive. It depends on how the OMB OIRA desk officer pushes it, because you can put it in a directive and then we can tweak it. Hopefully we'll allow public comment and continue that negotiation to make sure we get it to where it needs to be. But, these are also security concerns, right? Yeah. So as we go through the department and we find out that we in industry came up with an agreement that can't be done because, oh no, this guy's already broken this, you can't do that, you got to make it this to protect it, then we're going to have to acquiesce to that.
I'm really glad to hear that collaboration is going on across agencies. A while ago, I saw a rule come out from Veterans Affairs, and it was requiring incident reporting, I think, within 1 hour of even a suspected incident. I think it was a proposed rule, so they may have backed off of that. But especially with those ODPs, as you mentioned, if we can have a standard that will make it a lot easier for especially small business who support different agencies, because that creates a whole level of burden for sure, just to manage different ODP versions across agencies. So I'm a VP of Cyber at a defense contractor, and we are already seeing a specific opportunity that came with NIST 800-171 revision 3 from another agency.
Okay.
And so we're looking at a strategy to future-proof ourselves, get our CMMC certification, but at the same time address 800-171 revision 3. But we all know there are contractors out there that haven't done much yet. Yes. So what would be your recommendation to them in mind that 800-171 revision 3 is out today? What should they do? How should they approach it?
Today, the 7012 clause says you have to comply with the recent version, right? We weren't lucky to be able to put that in our rule. We had to annotate a revision. So we've got a class deviation against the 7012 clause today that says, hey, if you're level 2, you can stay level 2 until we do the rulemaking to bring in Rev 3 for CMMC, and then we'll lift that deviation and you'll have to comply with Rev 3. Now, if you're a company that hasn't started anything, then I would say you go for Rev 3. Right? Why are you going to waste your time doing Rev 2 unless you get together with a consultant and they say, well, financially, you're smarter to go for the Rev 2 and then take the next step to the Rev 3. I think what we, in our review of the difference between Rev 2 and Rev 3, most all of the 110 requirements, I don't think very few were deleted. a lot of them were combined with other requirements. So you got 20 more, right? But they combined requirements, so it still looks like there's only 110, but they've collapsed it. So, get with your consultant, figure out what the best means for you financially is. But we are working with the cyber AD to put out a directive to the assessors that say, hey, if you encounter a Rev 3 compliant environment, this is what you need to do to be able to give them an assessment at the Rev 2 level, right? And understand that it's Rev 2. You will be able to garner a contract award with your current CMMC level 2 certification, whether it's a Rev 2 or Rev 3 environment, until we get our rulemaking done where we upgrade the CMMC rule to Rev 3. So, I think each company's got to look at it, look at their finances. If it were me, I'd go for Rev 3 because it's better and it's more protection, but you got to look at what makes best sense for you.
So is the thought that there is a direct mapping to 800-171 Revision 2 and Revision 3? Or is it that if there's not, we're going to accept that because that's the newer standard?
We'll have to do a mapping for the assessors to say, hey, when you look at this and it's this, that's actually new Rev 3 and you can accept that, right? So we're definitely going to have to do that mapping. I don't think it's a heavy lift. Now my team might be like, are you kidding me? I don't think it was a huge lift to come up with that conversion. So, that's what we're going to do for the assessors. But they'll have to have some continuous learning to make sure that they're ready to do those assessments when it rolls.
Something else that is interesting is the primes, right? They're responsible for compliance at all tiers of their supply chain.
Yes.
Talk to us about putting the responsibility onto the primes.
So, it's funny because throughout my career, we've always talked about privity of contract, right? And that was a common law that went into place so we couldn't do end runs and flatten the supply chain. But it's outlived its usefulness. Now your primes need to know who's in their supply chain because we're going to hold them accountable. If you're passing that CUI, you got to make sure who you pass that data to is certified and able to handle it. So you're going to have to know where your data is going. And so a lot of the primes today that are working with their subs are already pushing the requirement for CMMC down the supply chain, telling their subs, we want you ready to roll so we can answer any RFP that comes out and you're prepared to handle it. So we are holding them accountable because we have to. We have no other way.
I was speaking with Joy Beeland from Summit 7 the other day, and she showed me this amazing graphic, I think it was from RSA, with data up to 2020, showing the compromises throughout the defense industrial base. And many, many years ago, it was prime contractors. But looking at the more recent data, it is all supply chain, subcontractors,
Right.
nearly all of it.
If you're a sub or small and you're working underneath a larger company, you should be asking them, just send me the data I need to do my part.
Yes.
Right? Because where we have gotten lazy, and I laugh because I think, as a contracting officer back in the day, part of my negotiation was to negotiate out extra hours for the CAD PM people to cut out the different requirements, right? Now I know that was a mistake because we got lazy and we send the whole tech data package down the supply chain. They don't need that whole tech data package. They only need the cutout of the welds that they need to do. I know everybody's heard my story about the welder that Katie went to see, right? They sent him the entire structural design of the F-22, right? And he had it on an open laptop with his Facebook Instant Messenger and his deliveries and all that stuff popping up. It was not secure at all.
Oh, no.
And, he was kind of like, ma'am, I'm a welder. What do I need with cyber? And it's like, well, okay, a couple things, right? They can steal those designs and now they have a commensurate weapon system. Mm-hmm. They could go in and change the tolerances on those welds that they're telling you to weld. So now your quality goes down, right? And then you lose business and we stop using you. So they're eroding our industrial base. Or they steal your data and your account information, which has happened to several contractors, but it's not widely known, and I'm surprised that people aren't squawking about it, but I met a guy that was in construction. He lost 40 grand because he didn't have his system secure, and they got in and messed with his cage code and changed the account information. So when he got paid by the government, it went to their account. So he's calling the government like, where's my payment? You're supposed to pay me within 30 days or I get interest. And they were like, no, we paid you. And he's like, no, you didn't. And they're like, well, yes, we did. And when they went back and traced it back, they had changed the account and it went to somebody else's bank account. And sadly, DoD, we budget down to the penny. So do we have another $40,000? Say, oh, sorry, you got robbed. Let me give you another. No. And then what are you going to do? Who are you going to go to? You got to take care of yourself. You got to protect your own information to make sure that you don't have that happen. Now, the good thing is we have talked to the large cloud service providers and said, hey, is there anything you can do to help to provide a low-cost capability for small and medium businesses? And we've also got a couple of cloud pilots going on. The Office of Small Business Programs has a pilot that they're working that they're going to start onboarding people in January. The Army has theirs called Encode, and they're going to be onboarding companies. They think maybe like December, January timeframe. It's going to be on a first-come, first-served basis. So, companies can sign up for that. I think I've heard Navy's looking at one as well. But are those sustainable? Are those something that we could scale and we could have enough companies covered by it and we can afford it, right? But I think the good thing is industry has recognized this need. There's been a groundswell of different companies that have provided and come up with solutions. The large cloud service providers are actively working with other partners to help provide solutions. So I think we're waking up and the nation is starting to answer the call, right? And, I hope and I pray that we get there before something catastrophic happens.
Bonus question for you. How many contractors are in the DIB? I've seen 80,000, 200,000, 300,000. What should be the number we're actually talking about?
We have to stratify it, right? So there are roughly, from what we can estimate, right? Because I think today CMMC will be another way to help us understand what the universe is. Because today, because of privity of contract, right, a lot of the primes can only see one or two levels below them. And so they're not sure what's farther down the supply chain. So we estimate that the DIB writ large is roughly 220 to 300,000 companies. Now, of those, roughly 80,000 companies handle controlled unclassified information that would rise to the level 2, right? And then for the level 3, the higher level of information that's characterized as CUI, you're probably looking at about 300 to 1,000 companies in there, depending on how we shred it. But, I think one of the things that muddies the waters is if you have a company with multiple divisions and multiple cage codes, we typically do those assessments by cage code and environment, right? So if you are doing classified work over here and you have a different system than you do in your other division, then you've got to draw that boundary and decide how you get your assessment. Do you split up each one of those by facility? Do you do it by business unit? Do you do the entire enterprise? How do you handle that? And that's going to be up to each company to make that business decision. What's the most important thing? You should probably look at securing as much as you possibly can, right? And continuing the journey.
Hey folks, you may not know this, but I'm also leading a CMMC compliance program at a defense contractor. There's a lot involved with CMMC, and I understand how it can feel overwhelming. I was there myself many years ago, but since then, I've created CMMC training focused on defense contractors. The training covers everything from DFAR's contractual clauses to NIST 800-171A, and of course, CMMC. It's received over 100 5-star reviews and is certainly worth checking out. Find it at grcacademy.io. Now back to the episode.
Let's talk about the phase in. So you've increased that from 6 to 12 months, the first phase,
Yes.
which I think will be very helpful. But after the first phase, CMMC level 2 certification definitely becomes a requirement. Also of interest, you could still do that in the first phase.
Yes.
So what is the criteria for determining CMMC level 2 certification in phase 1?
So it's going to be on a program by program basis, right? If
Okay.
a program manager today says, look, I'm working on a technology that we know is in high demand and our adversaries are coming for it, and it's a huge vulnerability to the department to pass this information to somebody who's not protecting it, then they would have the ability to say, hey, this is so important, it needs to have a certification.
Got it.
Now, most of the PMs are going to know who they're working with in the DIB. They're going to understand who's in the realm of possibility, who can perform the work. And so they're going to know whether or not they are ready for CMMC. They'll probably have conversations like, is this something that we could do? We really think there's a huge risk here. We want to impose it. Now, what the phasing also allows, though, is I can award a contract day one without requiring CMMC certification that day, but I can make it a requirement for the exercise of the option, which gives that company a year's worth of work to be able to get there. Because what we're hearing from most of the DIB partners is it takes 6 months to a year to get certified if you haven't done anything. So, that we're trying to give programs the latitude to make sure we have the protections and the assurances done. We all know we can't bring the work of the department to a grinding halt until everybody gets certified, right? I mean, there's requirements where you've got to keep the acquisition process moving. That's one of the reasons why we made this a pre-award requirement, not a post-award requirement. Because if you make it a post-award requirement and the company's not done anything, I can't pause that program for a year while I wait, right? Because we've got to have obligation execution benchmarks that we have to meet. And if you award the contract, give them the CUI, and they're not certified, how do you get that data back? If somebody says, oh, yeah, like today, trust me, I'm there, yeah. And you when you find out, oh, no, I can't scrub it, right? So I have to know when I give you that data, if you're not certified and you haven't done anything, then I'm accepting a risk.
Yeah.
And then we have to try to, from a department standpoint, we've got to figure out a risk mitigation plan, right? We got to figure out how to protect that data, because otherwise we're throwing tax dollars away because we're just handing that information to our adversaries, right? Because they're sitting there waiting, going, yeah, give it to Bob. He doesn't have any certification. He hasn't done anything. Yes, he's easy peasy, right? I've been in his system for 6 months waiting for this,
Right.
So that's what we got to make sure we protect against.
So phase 1 obviously is going to be critical for the DIB, as well as acquisition workforce, the program offices, and training and all of those things. Any other thoughts for phase 2, 3, or 4 that you would like to share?
The one thing with phase 2 and 3, phase 2 is where you start seeing CMMC level 2 as a requirement. Right? You don't see level 3 until you get to phase 3. So companies have a couple of years if you think you're going to be phase 3 to get that together. Also, while we're in these phased rollouts, the DIPCAC is going to do the phase 3, but they're going to have to go through training and a certification exam, just like the assessors do for level 2, to ensure that they're doing it correctly and getting all that training and everything set up and ready. They're working it today. I think they're going to do some mock level 3 assessments here in the next year or so to make sure we have the processes and procedures down. So a company that's like thinking they may want to be level 3, they could, volunteer to be a guinea pig and go through the mock assessment and see how that works. That way, and then we'll be able to put out training and information about, this is what you will expect to see during that. Then by phase 4, we're hoping we'll be in every contract and everything will be, protected. Also, not so naive as to think that we're going to roll this program out and there's not going to be a glitch or a hitch or something where we go, ooh, we didn't think about that. Ooh, okay, we need to go back and adjust, right? Adjustments are going to have to be made. We have worked extremely hard to make sure that we built in quality, integrity, to make sure that every company is treated the same and assessed the same, that there's not the wink, wink, nod, nod, give me $50 and I'll now you and I know you can build it as hard as you can. Mm-hmm. And there's always going to be somebody that's going to be one step ahead, that's going to figure out a way around, and we're going to have to close those gaps and holes as we go. One of the things that I've heard, this is the biggest, most complex rule that DoD has ever done. We're not a SEC. We're not a regulatory agency, right? We don't write rules every day. And so, with the help of our desk officer at OMB OIRA, and with all of the different people in the interagency that reviewed this rule, I think we did the best we could. But I'm not so naive as to think that there aren't going to need to be changes made, right? I think at some point with cybersecurity, there's going to be a need to change the way we impose the requirements, because rulemaking takes 2 years, mm-hmm. right? The technology is moving at such a rate that 2 years, it's a has-been by the time we can ever impose it. Right. Mm-hmm. And so we've got to figure out as a nation, as a society, how we protect that as a whole. Right. Pepsi, they keep their recipe pretty safe. Right. We need to be thinking that way.
CMMC is also going international, and there are many countries that are looking at CMMC as well. Some are standing up their own programs. I know Canada is doing that, and heard of some others. Can you tell us what countries have expressed interest and are looking at this as well?
Most of our allied partners are. We've had conversations with UK, Norway, France, Japan, Israel, Australia. I don't want to insult anybody by not bringing them up, but sure. Those are the ones I can remember now. Those are the most active ones. And, so a lot of these countries have their own cyber programs, but because we have to treat all contractors equally, right? It wouldn't do for us to say, oh, you're from the UK, you don't have to do as hard of a requirement as we make our own companies do. Everybody will be required to step up and meet the CMMC requirement. If you're a country that has sovereignty concerns, you're going to need to have a C3 PAO established in your country. They will have to work with our AB. There are mutual recognition programs that they can have. An AB in UK deals with our AB. Your assessors and your C3 PAOs are going to have to go through the same processes that ours are. They'll have to be educated and tested. They'll have to have that level 2 certification to make sure that they can handle the data before they can start doing assessments. At one point, we talked about reciprocity, but when we got into the rulemaking to ensure that everyone was treated the same, it was determined that we needed to make other countries meet our requirements and our processes and procedures the same.
So it sounds like countries that don't have those data sovereignty issues, they could use the United States C3PAO, although some are setting up equivalent programs.
Yes.
And it sounds like they might even have their own version of the cyber AB as well. Who actually works to make sure, because there's got to be reciprocity there and some agreements. What does that look like?
The whole ISO process is established so that they can work across international organizations. So for accreditation bodies, and it's the 17011 accreditation capability, and that's what our cyber AB is. So like Canada is setting up their own. Canada is in direct contact with our AB to make sure that they get the training and the exam that we use for their assessors. They'll set up a mutual recognition, MRA, MRL. There are two different kinds of mutual recognition agreements that they can come up with, where our AB recognizes their AB as being capable of doing the accreditation for their C3 PAOs and things of that nature. Canada today is working with Matt Travis at our Cyber AB to make sure that they have everything together. Our DCMA DIBCAC has gone to Canada to do some assessments for their C3 PAOs to make sure that they're compliant and can handle that. They've done joint surveillance assessments so they can see how we do our assessments, and we've gone there to see how they do their assessments, and we've done that with the UK. We're working with these different partners to make sure that we hold everybody to the same level of accountability.
It's been a long road getting from first mentions of CMMC to finally we're here. We're getting ready to begin the phase-in process. Talk to us about what your biggest lessons learned are.
Biggest lessons learned is from the get-go, we should have done the programmatic rule to make sure that we had it codified in regulation. Understanding the costs. That was the thing in the 7012 when that clause came out, there was no requirement for a regulatory impact analysis, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we really need to get on top of and understand is what does it cost, right? It's hard to quantify because each company sets their network up differently. So, we've seen companies that have gotten 110 and they only spent $5,000 because they have a very simple network, right? But then we've seen companies that's taken them like a couple $100,000 and it's because their networks are complex. So I think, understanding what that looks like and understanding how best to get at the problem is one of the biggest lessons learned, right? We recognized that we had a gaping hole and a vulnerability. We turned too quickly to get that closed and make sure that we have that, so understanding the threat, understanding how we can best get there. One of the things that I'm very grateful for is the collaboration with the DIV. And the feedback that we get and the fact that they've turned to help come up with solutions to help us get there, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Right. And we've got to continue that. We've got to continue the open dialogue. And as a citizen and as somebody who's worked for DoD and the IC my whole career, I understand the threat to our men and women that we're sending out in harm's way. And I want to ensure that they are protected and that they get to come home to their families at the end of the day.
Well, I think what people have to understand is when DoD contracts an organization, they're not only contracting them for their services and their expertise, they're contracting for the security to protect the information that they provide as well.
Right. And when somebody comes onto our soil marching to take over because we haven't done our due diligence in protecting, they're going to want answers from us, right?
Yeah. Last question. Do you think CMMC will expand to other federal agencies?
Yes. And in fact, it was funny because I've seen people on LinkedIn say that school systems are now requiring people to have a CMMC certification before they do work in their spaces. So I do believe, most of the federal government is watching CMMC to see how it rolls out, if it flops or if it succeeds. And they will join in based on whether or not we're successful or not.
It'll be interesting. Well, thank you so much, Stacy. Really appreciate your time. So happy to be able to speak with you. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome. And anytime, and if you need any more information or have any questions, just reach out. That's what we're here for.
All right.
All right. Take care.
Hey folks, hope you enjoyed that. If you want to see more, be sure to subscribe and then check out this video.